Hey, good morning. Thank you for joining us for another edition of Coffee Talk. My name is Sean O'Brien. I'm president of Quick Rate, and as always, pleased to be joined by Steve Huntington. Steve, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for spending some of your Friday morning here. My name is Steve Huntington. I'm the director of analytics here at Quick Rate and Quick Analytics. I've spent my entire career working with community financial institutions on everything from advisory and capital advisory, strategic planning to model design and maintenance. And I've been working with Sean here for a little over a decade.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And welcoming back to the program, our good friend Paul Allen from Saltmarsh. Paul, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself? Thank you for being here.
Sean, thank you. Steve, thank you for letting me join you. It's always interesting to talk a little bit about the implementation of CECL. We enjoy working with banks and credit unions, and so really interested in hearing some of the input and some of the process and thought process around CECL. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Just a little bit of information about Paul's firm. We'll talk a little bit about more of that here in a little bit. Just a reminder, a couple of housekeeping items. One, we will be sending out a link to the recording today, as well as a copy of the slides we used and the polling results. That will likely go out late Monday afternoon or on Tuesday. Today, during the presentation, certainly submit any questions through the Q&A feature or the chat function, and we will monitor those and take those as best we can during the presentation. But if not, then certainly at the end of the presentation as well. So just a couple of reminders on that. We won't cover this. We kind of know why we're here. We appreciate you being here. As always, or more recently, we have a few polling questions just to kind of get the day started. Just for today, certainly appreciate your participation. The first one that I'll launch here is what areas, if any, of your loan portfolio has a credit quality concerns as you look out into 2024. So as always, we'll just give this 30 or 45 seconds, and then we'll move on to the next polling question. Oh, shoot. I forgot the consumer bucket and auto. My apologies. I should have added those. I thought I had them on there, but I missed them. Okay, so we'll go ahead and share this one and share those results. Not too many credit quality concerns across the board, so that's encouraging. Let's move on to the next one.
Hey, Sean, I don't know if you saw, consumer was on there. It might have been below your screen.
Oh, it's just wasn't on my screen. Okay, good.
And about 90% of people said consumer.
Got it. Oh, thanks. I couldn't see it on my screen.
That's all right.
I missed it.
Oh, okay.
We didn't have auto broken out separately, but we had consumer as a whole.
Okay. Are you budgeting for higher or lower earnings in 2024? Just a single choice, higher, lower, about the same. Well, that's good to know, because I couldn't see it on my screen, so that's I thought I forgot it. Okay. Go ahead and give this another second or two. So on this one, 46% are budgeting lower, 30% about the same, and 24% higher. So thank you for answering on that one. Next up, around forecasting. Are you forecasting any changes to your reserve this year? Just a single choice, yes or no? And that one, share it. 57% of you say yes, 43% no. And then our final question around charge-offs. Do you anticipate any charge-offs from your loan portfolio this year? Just again, a simple yes or no for those. I'm sure those 95% said yes, 5% said no. So again, thank you for for participating in those. We'll make those a part of the email that we send out with the link and a copy of the recording today. So we thought we'd start off just talking about what we're hearing, but more importantly, talking about what Paul's hearing. You hear from Steve and I every month. We wanted to get Paul's perspective from their practice on what they're hearing around CECL and the ACL. So Paul, take it away.
Well, Sean, thank you. We get to work with lots of different financial institutions, and the good news is most everyone has moved into and has successfully implemented a CECL process. And so, we aren't seeing a lot of recommendations that say, hey, you did it wrong, the math is wrong, or you really missed it. We're seeing a little bit of a maturing of the process. And so most recently, the continued conversation or questions have to do with the unfunded commitment. That's certainly the hardest to estimate. It's an area that some institutions feel like they can just book the reserve in the ACL and not have to think about unfunded, but there's certainly a regulatory expectation that you look at that. Sean, it's kind of amusing because we're trying to estimate losses on the loans we fund. We know something about those loans. Those borrowers are actually our borrowers. It's doubly hard, if you will, to estimate a loss on a loan that we haven't even funded yet. So most institutions are going through a pretty straightforward process of saying, here's our unfunded commitments. We're going to make an estimate for how much of those actually make it to a loan, and then apply a loss factor to that. We see a few institutions that are just booking a sort of a flat reserve, like a flat amount for the unfunded. But certainly the thought process is to make an estimate of how many commitments actually get funded, and that may change over time, in different economic cycles. But we're certainly getting a lot of questions about the unfunded, and there's probably a little bit more angst about unfunded commitment reserve levels than there is about the actual ACL calculation. I think that's a fair statement that most people are still kind of struggling through that process. As we've gotten into CECL, we're seeing a little bit of a difference, if you will, or a variety of approaches in terms of how much documentation there is in the minutes. And I want to encourage institutions to think about that anyone picking up your board minutes is going to expect that there's some discussion of this major accounting pronouncement that we've all spent so much time on. And yet we still see a few institutions that in the board minutes it says the board reviewed the CECL package. Period. And no discussion about the board or discussion. So we're kind of thinking that you're probably going to hear more about the need for a little bit more documentation of the discussion about CECL and the implementation. And certainly I'd encourage you to periodically bring your board up to speed with, reminder, hey, we elected this approach. This is the vendor. In this case, we're using CECLSolver as the vendor, and this is why we're using them. Some of the information, the due diligence we did on selecting a vendor. These are the people that are actively involved in the institution, and this is kind of our overall process. And by the way, to the board, have we had any recommendations or criticisms from auditors or examiners or anybody else about the process? And so it doesn't have to be pages and pages, but I think it warrants, a paragraph or two from the board in the board minutes about the process and the fact that the board's been made aware of that. In a similar vein, we're starting to see, hey, now that we've gotten the CECL implemented and we have an amount that we're booked and so forth, we're going back and saying, just like every other function we have in the institution, we need to have process. We need to have procedures. How do we do this? Maybe a simple procedure of this is where it comes from. This is the process. And then we're going to get questions and are already getting questions about what's your backup. If these 2 or 3 people in the institution run CECL, if God forbid, they're out of the institution, who else is going to do that? And so we're starting to see those normal questions, Sean, about we've done a major implementation or change. So now there's an expectation, okay, we need to incorporate that, if you will, in our regular process and procedures, board minutes, and so forth. And that you may have a few folks rolling their eyes right now, but honestly, that's a good thing. It means that we've gotten over the hurdle of just implementing CECL, this thing we've talked about for so many years. And now we're talking about, how do we incorporate that and get that involved in the normal process and procedures and documentation of any other major function. So good news is the anxiety level's gone down a little bit, got a little bit calm. We have amounts booked. And now we're starting to get asked about, hey, do we have enough board minute documentation and so forth? So Sean, I don't know if that's amusing or not, but I mean, I think it's good news that we're over the hump and into the normal stuff now, if you will.
I think it's tremendous news, and I would agree wholeheartedly. I think over the course of the year, I think credit unions have done an incredible job of, like you said, making this process, kind of releasing the anxiety from it and having success with it. And now, we're talking about these things that like now are really fine tuning things, right? We're going to dig in a little bit
exactly
deeper,
right.
Here and there, but the hurdle that felt in some cases and at times really insurmountable to a lot of people, like we've cleared that hurdle. And so it does feel good to have a little bit of tailwind instead of headwinds, as we're talking about CECL, because the buildup was for so long, and there was so much concern about actually being able to manage this process. And I think that the credit unions have done a tremendous job of doing it. So it is kind of refreshing to think of that. We're starting to talk about these kinds of more stylistic and kind of fine tuning and painting around the edges, rather than still worried about just actually the accomplishment of tackling the reserve calculation. So that's great to hear, because we felt it on our side, but it's refreshing to hear it from your side as well, right? That as you're talking to your clients as well.
Absolutely. And that last item down there, I just wanted to mention, we continue to have a fair bit of question and perhaps even confusion about this whole topic of model validation. And so I'd like, if you don't mind, just talk a little bit about that, because regulators and auditors and finance folks are all hearing, and there's quite a bit of discussion about model validation, but would like to just point out, what really is that? And there's a couple different pieces. It's not one report that you're going to get. It's not one model validation, but rather the vendor is expected to be able to tell the client institution, this is why you can rely on this model. We're selling you a model, and we believe that there's integrity. Every time we put 2 + 2 in that model, it always comes out 4. There's a mathematical integrity about the model. But the vendor can't really say how you are using the model in your institution. So if you step down those aspects of model validation, data integrity is whether we're getting our data at our institution. So at our credit union, the loan information and the share information, the deposit information is our data. And so we have to make sure that that's going in. And then there's a model process integrity that says, if we put the right data and the right assumptions in, can we rely on this model that we've gotten from the vendor? And so there's really kind of a participation by several parties. The vendor typically provides for a model some form of a validation report, usually a SOC 1 or SOC 2. And that says the model regardless of where it's used, in what, what institution it's used, the model and the math works. And then the institution management needs to determine, hey, we need to have someone besides the person running the model. We have to have someone look over the shoulder and make sure that the right data and the right assumptions are getting in. And then down at the bottom of that page, there's a discussion about output controls. In other words, once we've run the model results, are the correct people in the institution, the board, the supervisory committee, if you have an audit committee, are they getting those? And so there's really two pieces to model validation. There's the piece that the vendor can provide to you, and then there's the piece that you, management, have to provide. And Sean, quite often that's outsourced. Most of the time, probably the folks in the institution that are involved in the model and most competent to test the model are the ones that are actually doing it. So, we have a concept, we don't test our own work. So usually there's not someone in the institution that can perform that. So it's often outsourced. If the institution's large enough to have an internal audit staff, the internal audit staff can do it. If they don't, they have someone else do it. But there is a fair bit of confusion about, my examiner asked me for a model validation report. So where is it?
Yeah.
Well, it's probably going to be two documents, right? It's probably going to be an internal audit report and a SOC 1 or SOC 2 type report from the vendor. So there's two different pieces of that. But we get that question a lot. I don't know if y'all get a lot of questions about that, but that is something that is commonly a little bit misunderstood.
Yeah, we definitely do. And so this is great to have your perspective about it, because again, as you pointed out, there's only so much we can do as the model provider. And so that's what we try to do. We do have our SOC 1 available for our credit unions under the blue CECLSolver resources button at the top of the page in the CECLSolver. And so that is our independent review. We engage a firm to review the tool. But then, as you pointed out, there's a lot of which the credit union simply needs to do, and either perform that, as you pointed out, which can be challenging, with someone outside of the production of the reserve in the institution, or you're going to be forced to hire a third party to do it. And certainly this is a topical and timely topic, as this is probably most requested in the year, when a tool like this or a model is introduced. And so it's the
Right.
timing for you to be here is great, because this is clearly an area where we're getting, a ton of questions, and there, continues to be misunderstanding about what we can actually do ourselves, and what the credit union, needs to perform independently or have a third party assist them with in the extra steps.
Yeah, and Sean, we're talking about this with respect to CECL right now, but this is true of all the model all the models that are used in a financial institution. I mean, even your core processor, the core processor will give you a SOC 1 or SOC 2 report, but there's a section on user controls and management. The vendor, the core processor, can't do that. We have validation SOC 1 and SOC 2 that are on interest rate risk or liquidity models, on anti-money laundering models. So we're using models throughout the bank. And so we just have to understand that periodically, not necessarily every year, periodically, usually when a model's implemented, and then periodically after that, somebody needs to look over the shoulders, if you will, and say, is this model output reliable? Well, does the magic box work? Does the math work? That's our SOC 1, SOC 2. And then garbage in, garbage out. Is the right data being put in? Are the right assumptions being put in? And are there output controls? And so that part is really the responsibility of management. And so we're starting to get a lot of requests for that in our firm. Most people didn't ask about model validation, the first time they ran the model. They've taken a few quarters to kind of get it working. And now examiners and external auditors are saying, so how do we know this is good? How do we know this process is good? Well, the The SOC 1 report is part of that, but there's also a piece that the institution has to do because it's the user controls, if you will, of using a model.
Perfect. So on this slide and then on the next slide, we tried to just kind of, recap what Paul's discussing, in terms of the data input, the assumptions and the output, and then who's responsible for what. And so on the following slide, again, we just tried to separate those, for what we can do, and we're providing that SOC 1, but then the credit union's management team is really responsible for a set of things, or again, to outsource it to a third party, such as Paul's firm. Now, Paul's going to be too modest to say this, but if you are looking for a third party firm, you can certainly use them. He'll likely tell you that you should, you can certainly search for someone in your local area. But if you are searching for a third party firm, Saltmarsh certainly can and will be available to assist you.
Ron, you're very nice to say that, but I would just tell all of your clients, there's a lot of great firms out there. We enjoy doing this kind of consulting work, but there's lots of firms. And so I would urge you to, check with whoever you may have used in the past to do internal audit firms, but certainly feel free to call me with any questions. I'll be happy to talk about it, but we're not here to sell. We're here to have a discussion, right? So.
Absolutely understood. That's why I said you're far too modest. But we did have a question come in. As a CPA auditor of a local credit union, I have some examples of disclosures for our 12/31/23 audit for CECL, but they're more geared towards large banks. I was wondering if you have example footnote disclosures for CECL that you could share. The credit union we audit is below 100 million with real estate and consumer loans only, not very complex. Paul, any thoughts on that?
The disclosure under CECL has been something that has been evolving quite a bit. I think almost all CPA firms, if they're asked by their clients about footnote disclosure, the low-hanging fruit is to go to the larger institutions and use those. Certainly, there's some guidance directly within the pronouncement that talks about the required disclosure. But this is the first year out for a lot of folks. So there's not a lot of just sample disclosures out on the internet. I would certainly encourage you to Google it a little bit. I'd encourage the CPA firms to work with their alliance firms. Most CPA firms have some alliance firms that they work with, and also to ask the credit union management to ask their peers for some examples. But that is an area, disclosure is an area that, all of the available examples really are for very large, either public banks or very large credit unions that have already issued financials. And so the smaller institutions are trying to conform that to be adequate, but perhaps not overkill.
Perfect. The next question is, what granularity of assumptions is the credit union expected to make? For example, our vendor has assumptions in their economic forecast modeling that are proprietary. Do these need to be audited?
The assumptions are estimates, and so they can't really be audited per se. In other words, the purpose of looking at the assumptions is really, is it reasonable to the size and complexity of the entity? And so, we use some peer analysis information, and we determine whether assumptions are reasonable for the institution. Now, you certainly can audit, if you will, the mathematical calculation, but the larger issue is that even if it's mathematically calculated in a way that you can redo, the real question is the assumption appropriate for your institution? And so I think the question that you'll get most frequently from auditors or regulators is about, where did the assumption come from, with the idea that, is that assumption reasonable and is there a logical walkthrough? Once that's established, then, Steve can comment. I mean, there's lots of tools within CECLSolver that can show you how the math works on a particular calculation, but don't lose sight of the fact that the real important thing is that assumption reasonable and should it be applied to your institution in the way that you're using it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point because again, I think with everything, context matters, but really we always want to start with your institution and as you said, Paul, what's most appropriate and reasonable and material for each individual credit union. Steve, anything you want to add there?
Nope.
All right. All right. So the next slide, we'll just move on to this internal control piece. Paul, anything you want to shed light here on?
No, Sean, we just really wanted to kind of share some information. Again, there's a lot of anxiety and concern about CECL, like it's the first time we've ever used a model, but we use models throughout the credit union industry and in credit and in financial institutions. So just wanted to kind of put a reminder around you should be thinking about these things with respect to CECL and any other model. What management needs to understand who can access the model. And so Steve will probably be talking about some things that you can think about with respect to user controls and limitations. The second one there, who can change the way the model works, is really the vendor provided SOC 1 or SOC 2 that says, hey, we have programmers, but they can't just change anything they want to. We have oversight and controls over that. The model inputs and the assumptions are really management and who's appropriately determining what the assumptions are and that the approved assumptions are actually input and so forth. And then that last one about model outputs, are there controls that once the report is run, are the right people at the credit union getting it? In other words, the supervisory committee or the board or senior management. And God forbid somebody runs a report and says, wow, this looks horrible, and I'm just going to put it in my desk drawer, so output controls are making sure that the right people get the report so that we can make intelligent decisions. So that really is a list of controls over any model, including the CECL model.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. I want to go back a slide or two. I'm not sure if I gave you the opportunity to talk about corporate governance or oversight. Was there anything else there that you wanted to add? I felt like maybe I skipped or moved too fast for you on that one.
No, I think those are really the model, the output controls, making sure that the right party, whether that be the full board or the supervisory committee or risk committee, is getting those. And periodically, remember we talked about board documentation. Periodically, management should be reporting it perhaps annually or every 18 months, just giving a report to, hey, this is how the CECL process is working. Have we changed any major assumptions? Sean, you and I were talking earlier about the fact that we're kind of expecting some changes in economic conditions over the next year. Well, some of those changes in the environment may result in us in management saying we should change some assumptions. Well, that should be discussed and approved by the appropriate governance entity to make sure that, hey, if we're going to move the needle in the way that the model is calculated, a key assumptions change, there should be some documentation of that in minutes in terms of discussion and so forth.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So let's move ahead to the next one. So as we've done throughout, we continue to try to just make enhancements and updates to the tool. A reminder that all of these are optional, but there is one that has kind of that we've added and are going to introduce and be released over the weekend. We'll probably talk about it. Well, we will talk about it in the next couple of coffee talks around user control and management. So Steve, I'm going to let you talk about what we've done here to assist and again address some issues that some institutions and their auditors had around user management and control.
Sure. So we've had a number of requests from users and from to give you more flexibility with how to manage and prove as part of an audit or a validation that you're properly managing access to the different tools that we provide, specifically in this case, the CECLSolver tool, and how that's and kind of how that's managed as part of your policy on working with models such as it. Keep in mind, this is an optional new feature. everyone who has access to the tool right now will still have access on Monday. That you don't have to use the user management page at all to continue doing things as you are. But if you have an audit where you have certain people in your institution where you want to give them access to only parts of Quick Analytics, you do not want to give them access to CECLSolver, or let's say for a separate validation you're doing, or for an auditor, you'd like to give limited access, read-only access to the CECLSolver tool. Those are now options. You can create a new user for, let's say, a limited time for an auditing firm, and tell them, listen, you can go in with read-only access. They can access all of the scenarios you've built. They can see all the pages on the tool and everything else, but anything that would be an input to the tool is grayed out. They can't change peer groups. They can't update or change any of the warms or any of the calculations, but they can view and see and download and export any parts of the tool. If you go to the next slide, Sean, we'll see how we implemented, or how we're going to implement that. So come Monday, when you log in to Quick Analytics and you go to the CECLSolver, you'll see on the top right there is a drop-down box that has your name on it. If you click on that, one of the options will be user management. So there's two different levels of users. There are standard users, and then there are admins. If you're a standard user for your institution, you're not going to be able to see what everyone else, all the other people that have logins, and what features and authorizations they have. You'll simply see your own data. So where the power of this kind of new tool is for admins. So if you go to the next slide, Sean, if you're an admin, you can click on the user management tab there, and you'll get a list of everyone who in your organization who is a user of any part of QuickRate or Quick Analytics. You can add or remove them as admins, which would give them access to modify other people's accounts. And for each user, you can click on them and you can see and modify any of their contact information. If somebody is inactive and you don't really want to delete all their info, but you want to kind of inactivate them from the CECLSolver or from Quick Analytics. Let's say you have a user who is an auditing firm and you want to give them read-only access to CECL, but only when they're doing the audit, right? Only for maybe a month out of each year or whatever. You can create a new user for them, give them read-only access, and then when they're not, for 10 months of a year, you can simply inactivate them if you so desire. The roles currently are, or the authorizations are, access to QuickRate, access to Quick Analytics, the whole package, and then specifically for the CECLSolver, full access to it, read-only access to it, or no access to it. Sean, did I miss anything in there?
Nope, I think that's great. I think, again, I just want to emphasize, as Steve just said, but I want to re-emphasize it. This is an optional thing. Again, this was developed in response to institutions whose auditors were asking them for this. We did not build it in initially because we did not anticipate that there would be much of a need for this. However, we had enough inquiries around it, so we've done it. But again, as Steve pointed out at the very beginning, you can log in Monday, nothing's going to change unless you need to incorporate these types of controls into your institution. So again,
or if you get a question in an audit to say, you need to, they want a list of all the users and who can interact with it and in what way, you can just come here and export or print this out, and you're good to go.
Perfect.
Definitely a best practice.
And
from an audit perspective, it's best practice to have, limit the ability for people to change things in the model, because you only want to have the right people change it that are authorized to change it. You don't want to spend a lot of time coming up with the CECL data and assumptions and then have someone arbitrarily go in and change those and perhaps not realize that's been changed. So, Steve, do you have any recommendation on the question of how many admins should an institution have? Is there any best practice of having, limiting the number of admins, or?
Yeah, I mean, admins have the ability to, on purpose or even by accident, delete users and add additional. They have a lot more flexibility there. So I would suggest whoever is sort of in control of how you utilize Quick Analytics or Quick Rate should be an add-in or should be an admin. Anyone who is just, part of an analyst team who might want to be helping you build a scenario or using Quick Analytics in general, just a standard user would probably suffice from that standpoint. And I think as part of it goes back to what the expectations of control over, do you have a higher responsibility if you are an admin? I would say yes, because there's more ways you can mess things up, right? So you want to limit the number of people who have full and complete access, not only for your own best practice and safety standpoint, but also from the purpose of a validation or an audit where you want to, kind of produce the fact that you're limiting who can make all these changes and who can access all the information.
We had a question come in. We currently use another vendor in Encino. Can we utilize CECLSolver to help validate and document Encino's results? Have others used your tool to do this? Paul, your thoughts on that? Can you use another tool as part of your validation efforts at your institution?
Yes, we haven't moved much into that in CECL yet, but in other areas like interest rate risk or bond valuation and things like that, it's fairly common to have two separate approaches and compare them. Obviously, you're going to get different results, so you wouldn't expect two models to work exactly the same all the time. So you have to pull that and then sort of reconcile the major differences and make sure it's reasonable. But that is considered a best practice, and I would expect that that we see more of that in some areas, tools that are put out by the NCUA or the Federal Reserve that are, the versions of the scale model and so forth that are put out that are very peer-based can be used as a validation, if you will. So with caution, yes, you can do that. And as long as you are paying attention to what you're trying to do, that one, you're using two different approaches and determining whether they're reasonable and can sort of be reconciled at the different approach, then that is considered a good thing in a model to be able to validate a model. So within limitations would be my answer. I guess that's it depends, right?
Well, I let you answer first because we do in fact have people who have done that. So I was going to make sure I was going to let you answer first. But yes, we have had other clients of ours, in fact, do that. I'm not necessarily remember it was on Encino, but on other tools that they were using. Steve, we've touched on this in previous coffee talks. I don't know how much you want to talk about it today, but just a reminder that this, since we're talking about validation tools, what you've built here to assist in independently validating calculations.
And this is really an auditor tool to help in validation when it's requested. So this is a situation where we certainly don't expect or suggest that you should utilize this in addition to the interactive tool. If you are in the process of doing an audit or doing some additional validation and you really feel like you need to dig into every single one of the numbers in order to kind of rebuild the entire wheel that we've built for you in the interactive tool, from a historical data standpoint, we have an Excel-based tool that we can provide. It's not something that you can do completely independently. You would reach out to us and say, here, this is the situation. I've hired a third party to do some additional validation. They've requested more detail on the historical lifetime loss rates that we can easily give them using the interactive tool. So do you have anything more detailed that goes through that calculation in more granularity? And so we would say yes, and we would send you an Excel file that pretty much is designed to completely mirror the historical part of the CECLSolver tool, and that is looking at all your historical loss rates by segment, calculating lifetime historical loss rates using that data over a look back period and over with a specific warm calculation, and going from each individual specific call report line item data points follow all the way through to the lifetime historical loss rate. That's what this Excel tool does. It can be a little verbose and complicated, but it's completely comprehensive. So if you were ever had your back against a wall and they were demanding you drag everything, through to from start to finish, then this tool will help you do that.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. All right. Just a couple of additional tools, again, that are available. Additional subscriptions applies, but a big focus of 2024 is while we continue to update and improve the CECLSolver, we are trying to build more tools just for credit unions in general. So currently, we have some, credit union data information. We have the Excel add-in tool that we've talked about. We've talked about credit unions at a glance, but our hope is in this year to bring more interactive pages that you would be able to access. Steve, anything you want to discuss there?
Nope.
Sure. All right. So as we did last month, Steve has continued to try to, not only analyze data from call reports, but also just user activity. So here's some industry data that Steve has put together that I'll let him talk about.
So this, for example, utilizes the our Excel add-in tool, which is a separate tool that you guys can subscribe to if you're really interested in getting full access to all bank and credit union fields over any point in time historically for any institution. So it's an open-ended tool that connects to our database and allows you to, let's say, pull a specific, create a specific peer group and look at different financial data points over time for that peer group or for individual institutions. Using that tool, I wanted to get a feel for what the trend in reserves has looked like before and after CECL implementation, both at the median or average level and below and above that. So you can see there that if you just look at the little chart, mini charts on the right-hand side there, that there is I wouldn't say a huge increase, but the bump that we saw in reserves as a result of everybody transitioning to CECL. And when that happened was as of for the first quarter, right? 3/31/23, you see kind of across the board a bump of a handful of basis points, 10, 12 basis points on average increase in reserve. And since that time, throughout the course of 2023, we've seen incremental increases in average and median reserve levels across the industry as well. So that kind of one-time bump and then a slow trickle of increase in reserves over the last couple quarters.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve.
Sure.
All right. And then just
and this was interesting. We since we have a lot of questions and we talk a lot about unfunded commitments, less so about the held to maturity securities for obvious reasons, but the unfunded commitments, how many, do you really have to create a separate reserve just for the unfunded commitments, and how much energy and time and how accurate does that have to be, et cetera, et cetera. And so just giving you, not making any subjective evaluation here saying yes or no, but just looking at the actual data, and what it suggests is, as of the end of last year, 78% of all the 4,800 plus or minus credit unions in the country had some level of unfunded commitments on their books. However, only 10% of the credit unions in the country had any ACL on any CECL reserve on that unfunded commitment, which means that 88% of credit unions with unfunded commitments still reported zero ACL on those unfunded commitments. Now, we've certainly seen situations where, we heard about this just earlier today, where an institution had was taking into account potential losses on unfunded commitments, but doing it by just having a slight bump in the actual ACL for the loan portfolio, which is the contra asset account on the asset side of the balance sheet, instead of establishing the actual reserve just for unfunded commitments on the liability side of the balance sheet. That is certainly not a best practice, and that's not what the CECL standard suggests needs to be the accounting treatment for it. But we have seen situations where, yes, I have an unfunded commitment, and no, you're not going to see it show up where you'd expect on the liability side. So there's all different reasons for that, but it just kind of goes to show that while you'd expect most institutions with unfunded commitments to have at least some level of ACL on them. If that level is so low that it's an immaterial amount, they may still be, and in many cases are still reporting zero on the call reports for it, whether that's here or there. Held to maturity securities, about a third of credit unions around the country have some level of held to maturity securities, but still less than 1% of credit unions are reporting any ACL on that portfolio, meaning virtually all the credit unions that have some level of held to maturities are still reporting zero. That is, in the vast majority of cases, still appropriate, completely appropriate. Why? Because the majority of held to maturity securities have no real credit risk, right? They're in government guaranteed type investments that, while there may be interest rate risk, there isn't any true risk of loss, of credit loss on the vast majority of those securities held by credit unions, which is why we see a zero balance. And I expect that to remain. So while I expect the unfunded commitment ACLs to trickle up from almost zero to something slightly higher, we don't expect much movement on the securities front. Paul, any additional thoughts on
I agree
that?
with that completely. Most HTM securities don't have credit risk associated with them, but they do, of course, have interest rate risk. And so the only reserve we have to put on is if we feel like there's credit risk. And so I do agree with that. And the sort of mixing up ACL on loans and the unfunded is something that we see not only in the credit unions, but also in smaller community banks as well, that they just book a little bit more reserve on the loans. I think that probably will become, more and more of a discussion topic with their auditors and their examiners, just saying, hey, they're two different balance sheet accounts. We need to keep them in two different balance sheet accounts. But I think that right now, Sean, we go back to this concept all the time, materiality. There's simply not a significant amount of reserve required on unfunded relative to total net worth or total assets. And so that is being kind of accepted at this point. And I agree with Steve, probably will start getting moved over to a more normal presentation as part of liabilities. So
yeah. And hey, Paul, just one question. I don't know if you've seen anything. Again, these numbers indicate that most credit unions don't have any HTM issues. But like, what do you typically see when a credit union does? How do they, is the process there dictated again on how they should kind of calculate that necessary reserve? There's no real provincial guidance on that either, is there, about how they should think of
there was already gap guidance on fair value presentation for securities, whether it's HTM or available for sale. And there's already guidance with respect to municipal type loans to have a credit type analysis done. So we're really using the fair valuation concept in securities to determine if there's credit risk on a security. So it is slightly different than what we do for a loan, where we're looking at a particular borrower and so forth. For securities, we're looking more at the underlying aspects and support for that security and how it would come back to us in principle. And so, like Steve mentioned, there's a lot more concern and risk with respect to interest rate risk than there is really credit risk. There's been very, very few actual bond defaults historically, so it's much more challenging to come up with a reason to show an actual calculation of credit risk on a bond.
So it's certainly acceptable that they evaluate it and determine there's still no credit risk and no reserve necessary.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say across, if you took all banks and all credit unions and called it just the financial institution industry, the vast majority have zero reserve on HTM securities. It's relatively unusual to have credit risk on HTM securities or reserve on HTM securities.
Perfect. Thank you. We did have a question come in. Hello. How often are the historical lifetime loss rates updated? Steve, you want to take that one? I think in
Yeah, they're going to be updated as frequently as we have new call report data and you change your look back period, right? So as soon as we get access to new call report data, right now the most recent obviously is the 12/31. We'll get access to the 3/31 call report data right around the end of April, right? A couple days after the filing period ends, which is about a 1 month period. And that's when we'll have all new historical data columns in the tool. Now, if you but whether the historical lifetime loss rate is recalculated is determined by your look back period. Now, the typical user case is, well, next quarter, when there's new financial data, I'm going to move my look back period to make sure it includes the most recent data. Well, as soon as you've done that, then it recalculates pretty much on the fly, right? As soon as you increase your look back period to include the more recent data that's now available, or decrease your look back period historically, or increase it in the other direction, anytime there's a change in the historical data in the look back period that's being used to calculate the loss rate, then that it recalculates pretty much instantaneously. So it's up to you guys when the historical lifetime loss rate is recalculated.
great. Steve, some more proprietary data that you've put together. Anything you want to share?
Yeah,
here?
no, we've shown this a couple times before. We're working on finalizing all of this internal CECLSolver scenario data on the credit union side. As we've mentioned here, a couple times we've shown this. This is a lot of new data here based upon thousands and thousands of user scenarios that have been run using our tool. This is bank data, meaning that you can see the call report categories. The segmentation that we have here matches what the commercial banks, community banks see on their call reports. Not exactly the same as what you see on your call reports, but it still gives you an idea of directionality and trends and changes. Right? You guys still have 1 to 4 family residential loans, just like community banks do with the first lien mortgages up top there. So this will give you an idea of all the thousands of scenarios that are being run using our tool. Are WARMs getting longer for mortgage portfolios? Are they getting longer on consumer loans? Or are people utilizing more Q factors or less Q factors as we move through our next credit cycle? And we'll keep updating this on a regular basis. We'll have it as part of the interactive tool at some point as well. So you don't have to come to a coffee talk. We'd love you to keep coming, but it won't just be here. But this will help you, give you an idea, and it'll help your defense and justification of the WARMs you're using, right? If the NCUA is giving us some good, helpful industry data on typical WARMs for smaller credit unions, you're doing your own WARM calculations or having us help you with that. This is another piece of data that will provide a sanity check or more justification for your WARMs being appropriate across the board. And the same thing with Q factor levels. We already have some peer data in the tool, but this is a lot more proprietary peer data, right? There nowhere does it really exist. You can't go and say, hey, show me on the call reports what levels of Q factors are people using, for other credit unions. That's not publicly available data. But since we have such a great chunk of the industry utilizing our tool now, we can use our own data to provide this additional support for your ACL calculations.
And as Steve pointed out, and as the little button here suggests, we'll have this, kind of aligned with the credit union call report data here soon.
Yep.
Let's see. Another question came in here. Have you had measures of volatility of results from period to period across the users? Are results volatile to central tendencies?
We don't see a huge, volatility across time. No, part of the whole idea of CECL is that we should expect to see smaller incremental changes in the industry in reserve levels as a result of, and that was one of the purposes of it, was taking a longer term approach to losses and reserving for losses. So if you have to take into account under CECL, they're saying, you now have to take into account all the losses you're going to see until this portfolio matures, meaning we have to consider a credit cycle that might not start for 2 years from now, whereas in the old methodology that was much less the case. And so far we don't have enough data yet to know to prove this out. But the expectation is as we go, there's going to be more front loading of reserves at the beginning parts of credit cycles, which means we should see smoother curves up and down in reserves as an industry under CECL than in the previous methodology. And the proof will be in the pudding there, but it's certainly the methodologies are designed for that to be the case. We see a wide discrepancy in reserve levels at different institutions, based upon the market that they're in, based upon the community or the that they serve as being credit unions. Some of you guys are going to be much more susceptible to credit to consumer losses or mortgage losses based upon your constituency. But so we see a wide variety in reserves, but we haven't seen a huge change in reserves at those institutions over time so far.
Paul, anything you want to add there?
Question.
Yeah, I think it's too early not enough has changed in the economic environment to warrant significant changes in the total reserves. But Sean, if you go to the previous slide, it completely makes sense up there under the warm changes on the 1 to 4 family. One of the things you can kind of get a little comfort in is when you look across those over 2023, they make sense, common sense, compared to what we know has happened over 23, that as rates moved up, our volume of new loans went down as people were a little bit more reluctant to make new loans. And so, you would expect if the aging of the portfolio, we don't have a lot of new loans, we'd expect the warm to go down. And yet at the same time, we can also consider the fact that, hey, with interest rate risk, with interest rates higher, there's going to be less refinances. So the existing loans may not pay off as quickly. So, in every one of those categories, when we think about the volatility, and something I'd encourage, all the folks on the call to think about is the volatility that about, that you've seen in the economy should be consistently shown up in the way that the warms move and different rates move, charge-offs and so forth. And so I think we can, as Steve mentioned, we're early on in this. We've just implemented this. We don't have 20 years of all of this data necessarily with respect to the way it relates to CECL, but the data is moving and is volatile and should be moving and volatile consistent with what you see in the economy. And so as Steve was talking about the warms, I went, yep, that's totally reasonable to me. Hasn't moved just one direction.
Yeah.
But you can understand that, hey, yeah, my volumes went down and more in residential origination as rates moved up. And yet the weighted average remaining life of the loans that are still there are in all probability longer because of prepayment risk.
And
so
you'll see that
it is encouraging to see the data, consistent with your expectations.
And I'd expect these to be a little smoother going forward. We had a lot going on last year, right? People were implementing CECL.
Yeah,
people were having their first audit. People there were changing methodologies, and so you'd expect some fluctuation in reserve levels as people were probably making bigger changes to their methodology, and bigger changes to how they're considering reserves or and everything else. But the longer we stay within the same methodology, you'd expect that we wouldn't be getting shifts based upon that, right? The shifts would just be based upon what people are seeing economic. And instead of reserves being the absolute trailing indicator of an economic shift, now they're going to be hopefully much more of a leading indicator of it, as institutions are being forced to project the future more and longer out than they had in the past. If you look at historical loss rates, historical reserve levels, right, and you compare them to the last credit cycle, reserve levels were the highest at the end and 1 year after the end of a last credit cycle. So 2009, 10, 11, if we all remember that period of time, before or after in some parts of the country, but on average, 2009, 10, 11 had the highest losses the industry's seen in a very long time. The reserve levels were highest in 2012. Under CECL, I would expect that to be shifted significantly more towards the beginning of the cycle. Not that we're all here accurately prognosticating the economy, but the way the methodologies are designed, they force us to look at that a little bit more further in advance. And if you go up 2 slides, you'll see that, Sean. Back 2 slides. The first one that I was just talking about, you'll see the change in time there. So we don't see. I show the 10th and 25th, and so we see. While there's not a huge amount of change in the reserve over time for the average or median credit union, if you look at the 10th percentile versus the 90th percentile, there is large volatility in a large range of reserves, right, at any particular point in time. So the 25th to 75th percentile for all the NCUA peer group 5, which is about 1,100 credit unions in the 1 to 500 million range, that's what this data is coming from, ranged from 30 basis points to like 80 or 90 basis points from the 25th to 75th. So a very wide swath of reserves for institutions at a point in time.
Great. Question came in. Has there been anticipation of how margins will be squeezed following a period of years of rising rates, calculating average life assumptions upward at exactly the worst time when loan yields will begin going down, when rates drop and prepayment speeds pick up? Is there flexibility to override average life assumptions in a scenario like this one, and will regulators approve? The basis for the questions assumes that higher average life assumptions will mean carrying higher provisions in ACL.
So that's I would say it's based upon the tool. I mean, calculating your CECL, and the way our tool works is the first half of it is what would history suggest, and the second half is how we think things might be different in the future than in history. So while you can override a historical lifetime loss rate with another value that you might argue is more appropriate given what we expect to see moving forward, in my opinion, that's the domain of the Q factors, right? You can certainly modify your look back periods with the historical data to get something you think is more reasonable, but overriding a historical value with something you think might be more appropriate that is no longer a factual historical value, that's really the domain, in my opinion, if I'm reading the question right, of the qualitative factor adjustments and how we adjust that factual historical number for how we think for what's going on now and how it might be different moving forward.
But and part of his question was, can he override the average life assumption? But I just kind of point out that when we're talking about the average life estimate, for example, on residential, not only are you talking about the fact that your refinance equation has changed, that people are less likely to refinance going into higher loan yields, so therefore your loan will extend or be longer. But keep in mind also that the new loans going into that average life assumption for that portfolio is going to be modified as well. So while some of my existing loans will extend, I will also be putting on less new loans. And so that naturally, there's several things going on there. So if it were me, and this is a style question or preference question, I think I would be less likely to be changing my average life assumption. And as Steve mentioned, I might be going into my forecasting of economic conditions effect and changing that loss factor rather than the average life. This is a question that goes to trying to predict what auditors or regulators will audit the most, right? So I think that if you can mathematically calculate your average life assumption and show that historically, then it makes a lot of sense to say, but I may have less impact on my reserve by adjusting my economic factors, because really the question you have is, when economic factors are changing, is that in a future period going to change my prepayment rate assumption? Right. So, you can adjust that, squeeze that balloon in a lot of different areas. I would just respectfully suggest perhaps that every time I can find a historical number that I can actually tie back to history, I'm probably going to want to use that number. And if I have a concern about going forward, economic conditions are going to change that loss that is generated by that assumption, I probably want to do that in my qualitative factors instead of adjusting sort of a factual historical number. But Sean, that and Steve, that's me. That's
Yeah.
my opinion. Please be careful with that. So
I agree with it too. And the only thing I would add to both of your points is this is perfectly, in my opinion, one of the examples why we built the customizable look back period too, right? So your
Yeah,
warm
me
is your
too.
warm, but we give you the ability to evaluate that warm, incorporate in a much longer economic cycle. So you can expand it already and kind of capture a fuller economic cycle and bring it back to your current warm. And then, as Steve and Paul indicated, adjust your Q factors. But I think that gives you the ability that if you're concerned about the warm, the most recent warm hasn't seen much in terms of losses, you extend that in your look back period. You might incorporate something from a previous economic cycle, still have it be reflective of your current warm, and then with your Q factors, you'll have a better sense of what might be appropriate. So again, it's just a little bit of the functionality.
Multiple ways to skin that cat. You could make the argument that we're seeing prepayment rates, decrease. We expect that to continue to be the case. I'm going to go into my warm calculation, change my assumption for prepayments on my existing portfolio, and that will lead to increased warms and probably more losses in the historical period. On the other side of the coin, you might say, I had a really good prepayment study done, that's with, 6 months ago. And we're going to go with that with our historical warms. But in the Q factors, I'm recognizing that I think the prepayments are going to be a lot higher moving forward. So we're going to make an economic adjustment with the justification being, I expect lower prepayments, hence longer warms and a slightly higher losses and reserves as a result of that.
Perfect. One other question. What about other CECL models like advanced vintage? How far should we look? Is there data to augment our institution's loss experience to go back to, say, pre-2008 financial crisis? I mean, I think one of the reasons why we didn't go back to further than 2008 is for most institutions, the worst losses were, 2008 to 2012-ish, 2013. So our feeling is if you're trying to incorporate what things could look really bad based upon an economic turn, that probably going back further is probably not going to give you worse data than what we saw in 2008. So that was kind of our, jumping off point of why we started there. Steve, I don't know if you want to add more about that.
It's about relevance, right? How different did your portfolio look in 2004, say, than today? And is there really any relevance to how you performed 20 years ago versus how you expect to perform over the coming years? And there's practical considerations with going back further in time. The call reports keep changing over time. We've got a heck of a lot more data and buckets and segments and everything now than we used to have in the past. Every year that we go further back in available financials in the tool, we have to be necessarily more limiting in the amount of granularity in buckets that we provide to you now. Because if you look at a 2001 call report, for example, there aren't as many loan buckets and charge off and recovery buckets as there are now. And so in order to get a 25-year loss history, perfectly apples to apples, you need 25 years worth of a segment that hasn't changed. We haven't even had 3 years of a segment that hasn't changed after the NCUA went in there and obliterated the call reports 2 years ago and changed all of our loss buckets right at the time we were all preparing for CECL. So that's a practical consideration there. But I would say the bigger risk there in trying to go back 25 years is you're going back, multiple or more than one entire economic cycle, and you're taking into account data that is all from before anyone at the institution, for the most part, was there. And how relevant is that to your current expectations of future losses or not? But no, there's no way to go back before that using our tool. To answer the explicit question, our tool stops there for all those reasons and more. And so there's no way to modify our tool incorporate data from before then. If you want to do your own calculations from prior years and then make an adjustment to the a manual adjustment to the historical lifetime loss rate to incorporate it, yes, you can do that and we can help you with that. But the tool, there's no switch we can flip to make it automated for you.
Yeah, I was just going to also say that, you know, one of the arguments against using a very, very, very long look back period is, you know, we're trying to predict the losses for the remaining life of the portfolio. Well, if we have a weighted average remaining maturity or life of, say, 8 years or 10 years, why would we go longer than that? In other words, we're trying to predict looking forward the remaining maturity of the life of the loans that we have now. So there's a pretty good argument that your look back would be equal to the longest weighted average life that you have in the portfolio. There's another argument that says, well, maybe we should look at the economic cycle, which may be longer than that. But, you know, as Steve said, the more economic cycles you add in doesn't necessarily mean that the information is better. It may actually even reduce the loss factor looking back because you're averaging over it over such a long time, so many good years compared to the number of good or bad years you might have in your forward weighted average remaining life of the loans that you have. So there's some pretty good academic discussions here, but going back longer doesn't always mean a better reserve number, you know. A more accurate reserve number.
It does mean additional data, and data is a double-edged sword because more data many times is good. But more data not always is good because you have to justify all the data you're choosing to use.
That's
you know,
exactly
if you're going to say, you know, I've got a WARM of 6 years, and so I'm looking at 6 years worth of data historically. That seems to me to be easier to justify. And then any changes via Q factors from that 6-year period that we all kind of remember, that's relatively fresh in our mind, versus the justification needed to go back to 2004. They're going to say, well, what exactly was going on in your portfolio in March of 2004? And why do you think that that's relevant to have as part of your expectation moving forward? So you got to justify what was going on in 2004 if you're going to use 2004, which from a practical standpoint, it's a lot harder than just looking at time periods where we all kind of remember the factors in play and what our portfolio looked like.
Absolutely.
Perfect. All right. I know we're over the hour here. I wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, if you are looking for help with validation, Saltmarsh is a trusted and great resource. There's contact information for you here. We will also, you may have noticed there's a link at the bottom. We've tried to, as best we can, start to incorporate and warehouse a lot of these different presentations we've done and put them out on YouTube. So there's a link there at the bottom. You can see different presentations that have been conducted. This will be an area we try to even do more so of that within the tool. Again, just trying to make things more readily available to you. We will be back in March for another coffee talk on the 29th. So certainly encourage you to register, as if you register, you'll always receive a link to the recording and a copy of the slides. Paul and Steve, any final words before we let our folks get to their day and weekend?
No.
Not for me. Just have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks for.
Well, again, thank you very much, Paul, for joining us. This was fantastic as always. Thank you, Steve. Thanks to all of you for joining and making these coffee talks so special. We hope you have a great day and a great weekend. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Everybody.